Greetings, classicists, and welcome to Politics of the Late Republic 20-mark videos. Oh, the cat's had enough. Thank you, Amy. A vote of confidence, spoiling everything. So, we are very briefly today going to look at how to do 20-mark questions with a focus on politics of the Late Republic. So, let's get started. Now, in the Politics of the Late Republic exam, you won't be too familiar with it yet, so don't panic, but just a reminder, if you like, that you'll be doing one 20-mark question. It will be 30 minutes long, and it doesn't require secondary sources. So it's a little bit different to World of the Hero, where you have 26, 27 minutes, however you want to calculate it, but it's exactly the same as Invention of the Barbarian. You've got one 20-marker, and you've got 30 minutes to do it with no secondary sources. So a lot of the techniques are similar to Invention of the Barbarian. But of course, being politics, there's a slightly different focus. So this is a generic structure for all 20-mark questions, really, be they World of the Hero, Politics of the Late Republic, or Invention of the Barbarian. So a very brief reminder of what is in an essay, because after a long and exhausting summer break, you may have forgotten. So, what should be in our introduction? Well, we need to identify the factors that we're going to use, the areas of argument, and especially with something like Politics of the Late Republic, we maybe need to include a few definition of key words and key terms, especially if we're tweaking them or changing them or using English in a slightly different way, or if something in the question is unclear and we want to cover ourselves with a definition. There's an important word in the essay that we will be looking at, so bear that in mind for later on. Now, as you're very familiar with what happens next, we've got our 3 paragraphs, maybe 2, maybe 4 if that's the way the gods take you, but the ideal number, if you like, is 3 thematic paragraphs with between 3 and 4 examples. That's our kind of basic structure from which you can deviate. Then we're followed with a conclusion, in which we really drive home our answer to the question and identify the most important factor, the thing that contributes most to our argument. Again, as a point of general principle, there's always some slight variations in that. But there we go. Politics of the Late Republic, 20 markers, very similar, if not identical, at least in terms of practice and theory, to the others. So where are Politics of the Late Republic 20 markers a little bit different? Well, that is in likely structures. There will be some very similar structures that stretch across all 3, depending on the question asked, but there are some slightly different structures that you can use in Politics of the Late Republic, and of course you've got to respond to the question. So because Politics of the Late Republic is quite historical, what we will see appropriate at various points is like a chronological structure. So you may take our time frame, 80 to 43, and think, well, actually, this can be split up into 3. Now, the paragraph should reflect points where there's a turning point or a key event. Don't just randomly take out your calculator and divide it into 3. Would that work? No, probably not. And because you haven't studied the course, there's not going to be some obvious structures knocking around in your head at the moment. But do think about a chronological structure. For example, we could say up from 80 up to 60 BC, you've got the rise of the rise of Cicero and the sort of pre-triumvirate period. Then 60 down to the Civil War, you've got the triumvirate and then the Civil War between the triumvirate, and then you've got post-Civil War. So big chunks of time might work as a chronological structure for Politics of the Late Republic. The other structure that you could think about are key individuals, because this is a course focused on the ideals, beliefs, principles of key individuals: Cicero, Cato, Pompey, Caesar, and others. So sometimes, where appropriate, a paragraph on each key individual could work. 3 key figures, 3 paragraphs, perhaps. Now, of course, any essay, a thematic structure responding to the terms of the question is always going to be a potential way of thinking about it. And this could be different sort of political principles, political ideas, there's all sorts of things that you could do. I'm trying not to try not to do too much that you won't be familiar with at the moment. So, well, actually, we'll park that there because you'll see that in a minute. Now, if you have got a sort of fourth structure, if you like, is a for and against for and against response, and that works quite well potentially. Ideally, we like you to write 3 paragraphs. Sometimes 2 with a for and against is effective. It keeps it simple. It depends on how much you can write, and it depends on what's in your brain. I would try and go for 3 with some themes, with a more complex way of breaking it down. But sometimes when you're sitting in the exam room in a sweaty panic, for, against, nice big detailed paragraphs, introduction, conclusion, boom, job done. Do you agree? Yeah, the categories. So let us look at the summer essay that you will now be attempting. Dun, dun, dun. No. Oh, it's opposite. There we go. Oh, yeah, right. So, outside of the Senate, the people of Rome were politically powerless. Discuss. You may use your knowledge of Roman politics and social hierarchies as a starting point and should justify your response. The only slight alteration I'd make to that is you should. You have to use your knowledge of Roman politics and social hierarchy, otherwise the essay will not make any sense. So let's think about some keywords, and this is when we're kind of going back to our introduction, because I think there are some words that require some definition in this question. Outside the Senate, the people of Rome were politically powerless. Well, I think we need to think about what Senate means, certainly. I think we need to think about the people of Rome, and perhaps also politically powerless, because there's ways we can interpret those words. I think there's some valid ways of interpreting those words, and there are some insane ways of interpreting those words. If you describe the Senate as a powerful clique of lizard magicians, that's not valid. You can't do that. But if you want to think about variations on the term Senate, well, maybe there's a debate to be had here. So, when the question talks about the Senate, what does it mean? Does it mean the class or the institution? So, does it mean people who have been senators at any point and are now off being generals or provincial governors? Or does it mean the meeting of the political body? Because as we see when the course evolves, there is a potentially quite important distinction. People who have been senators, or are technically senators, but are away being generals or provincial governors, they come in conflict with what we would call the Senate. So what exactly do we mean by the Senate? And I think this is something that you can define in your introduction. You could say, well, I take Senate to be the Senate is a political body, but also anyone who has been a senator and is working as part of the system, so a general or provincial governor. But what do you think? And think about that when you're planning your essay. The other key word to define is people, because we might read the question and think, oh, well, that's talking about the poor people. And there's certainly an element of that being the case. The proletarius, as the Romans would call them, the poor people of Rome. But outside of the Senate, there is a huge number of other people. There are some very rich, very wealthy equestrians. There are very rich, very wealthy patricians who choose not to take part in politics for a whole variety of reasons. So we need to be very, very careful about that. We're not talking about the Senate versus the Romans. The poorer Romans are rushing around, beating people up with clubs on the streets and demanding grain dole and scratching around in the dirt, that sort of stuff. I mean, there's an element of that, and they're an important part of it. But the people outside of the Senate are absolutely the vast majority of the Roman people. Remember, the Senate at various points, it's a bit flexible, but they have 300 people in it. So everyone else is people outside the Senate. So what do we mean by people? Define that in your introduction. And I think the other important thing to think about, did I just miss out a word for some reason? No. The other important thing to think about is this idea of politically powerless. And there's another dynamic that I'd explore here, and I think that's formal and informal politics. because you could have a great deal of informal political power. For example, parking your army outside Rome and suggesting to the Senate that they make various decisions that you want them to make. That's not a formal political power, but clearly there are political consequences to the power you have. Maybe there's an element of this that can be seen with the mob as well. You know, are the Senate a little bit cautious about what they say or do because of the power of the mob? Maybe, maybe not. But I think that's something for you to think about when you're writing this essay. What does politically powerless mean? Are we talking about formal or informal or both? Okay, so now that you've thought about those keywords, let's explore the nature of the power of the Senate. Ta-da. So, I would say we can split our ideas of senatorial power into formal and informal, as we were talking about before. Now, there's a little bit more than this, but these are some of the basic things to think about. So the Senate's formal political power, I mean, maybe you could possibly even argue they don't have any. They can advise the consul. I mean, again, that's in that kind of grey area, isn't it? Is that a formal political power? Anyway, you decide where that goes. They advise the consul, and in Roman society, the tradition is that the consuls take great notice of the advice of the Senate. The Senate can also propose a dictator in various circumstances, and this leads on to an SCU to be granted, and so on and so forth. So again, this, I mean, probably not the best example, if you like, of formal or informal power, because it's also complex. But there we go. So formal power, if you like, they advise the consul, they propose dictators. Informal powers. Now, this number one is where it gets really. This is probably the most important thing that the Senate do in terms of informal power. They select legislation for the assemblies to debate, and it is not required that the Senate select this legislation. In theory, as any rebellious tribune will tell you, you can take something straight to the assemblies and vote on it there. But tradition, custom and custom is that you put your legislation before the Senate, they debate it, and then they agree whether you can take it to the people. But it's not a hard and fast rule. The other informal power of the Senate and the sort of senatorial class, if you like, and this is again where this kind of debate comes in, perhaps. Do we mean by Senate, do we mean the political institution of people sitting in a room, or do we mean people who are senators? Because they drive votes with influence in the assemblies. Romans look to the classes above, especially the early classes, or tribes and centuries, and there's this powerful kind of informal weight. You follow the best men in society. So if those first centuries and the first tribes are all voting in one direction, there's a powerful kind of social pull. But are they all senators? Well, again. So the other thing that the Senate can do, which again is perhaps in that grey formal or informal area, is the idea of the SCU, the Senatus Consultus Ultimum. And this is the ultimate consultation of the Senate. And they empower the consul to take any action necessary to preserve Rome. Now that might be a sort of an individual action, like killing some pesky tribune. It might be empowering a dictator to lead for 6 months. So what are the informal powers do the Senate or senatorial class have? Well, once they have finished either as praetors or consuls, they then have the power to lead armies and govern provinces. And this is again where it gets a bit murky, because if you're arguing they're separate from the Senate, we've now got a sort of area of political power beyond the Senate. You could make the argument they are at one with the Senate. Because if you're leading an army, you've got huge influence with the Roman people. If you're leading a province, you amass a significant number of clients and wealth that then feeds back into your political campaigns when you return. Other significant informal power for the Senate are the idea of amicitiae, so friendships. Who are they friends with? Now, and a citiae, of course, means you're friends with someone of a broadly equal kind of political, social status. And patron-client relationships. Now, these are crucial. Think about all of these rich senators with people who live on their land, people who have served with them in the army, people whose families have lived on their land, served with them. This vast connection of patron-clients. And one of the duties of a client is to vote in a way that pleases your patron. So these senators have this vast informal patron-client network, and some of the poorer Romans most probably will vote for things that are against their interests in a sort of class sense, because in a personal sense, they're being paid by their patron. And the Senate, being some of the richest, most powerful men in Rome, will have these vast patron-client networks. It's quite difficult to put our finger on just how significant they would have been, but it's important to discuss it in terms of concept. So let's look now at the power of the people. So we have the split of formal and informal. So formal powers, you've got the tribunes. They are absolutely not part of the Senate. They are very formal and they have very explicit powers. They can veto, they can propose legislations, and they can summon assemblies. So I think in terms of a very, very simple response to the question, this is our kind of go-to counter-argument, the tribunes. Now, this is where it gets complicated, because to what extent are the tribunes always a kind of tool of the Senate? How do you become a tribune? It seems almost impossible that some scruffy farmer wanders into Rome, says, I'm going to become a tribune, and starts proposing radical legislation. They are almost always all not necessarily tools of the Senate, but they are part of the system of competition of the high status families of Rome. That doesn't mean that they don't do anything that benefits the people, but I think we need to be a little bit cynical about the approach of many tribunes. But anyway, technically, formally, we have got a centre of power away from the Senate. Now, the people of Rome also get to vote in the various assemblies for legislation and offices. So in theory, a poorer Roman person outside of the Senate votes on everything, but this is where we need to remind ourselves of the complexities of the structures of Roman assemblies, what makes up a tribe, what makes up a century, the bribery, the corruption, the threats, the fact that you've got a small number of people in the top tribe and everyone else in the bottom, all of this stuff which you've done in class. So we've got the idea or the principle that everyone votes on everything, but then we need to explore the reality of politics. Now, if we're going down our informal route again, we need to think about informal political power, and we can have a debate as to whether this is political power or not, but let's think about it. So we've got our mob, something that will emerge later on in the course, perhaps with a bit more clarity. What happens if the Senate do something that people really don't like? They go into revolt, and later on we shall see they burn down the Senate House. We've got the other end of the kind of patron-client relationship with veterans and clients, and this is perhaps a more subtle thing. As clients, veterans from the army, or just sort of social patron-client relationships that have been handed down through families, is there a kind of pressure or duty amongst the patrons and your political superiors to kind of look after you a bit, to take care of you, to give you land if you're a veteran, to give you grain dole if you're a client? Is there a sort of an element of slightly unstructured sort of political pressure that veterans and clients can put on those above them in the system? Subtle point, but give it some thought. So let's turn now to some likely structures for your essay. So if it's all a bit overwhelming, if it's all a bit much, if you don't feel you write very much, you could keep it super simple. I kind of tend to steer away from this, but I think we don't want to overcomplicate things. I think it could absolutely be valid for some of you. So, on the left, our simple structure, beautiful introduction. Paragraph 1, the people were politically powerless outside of the Senate. Paragraph 2, Oh no, they weren't. Conclusion. Boom. Some big meaty paragraphs, but perfectly doable. A slightly more complex structure that you could consider. Paragraph 1 would be formal senatorial power, because there's quite a lot to think about there. Paragraph 2, informal senatorial power. And again, you've got to think about what it means by senator. And paragraph 3, people power, or the power outside of the Senate, and you'd be debating formal or informal within that. But again, it's up. You could tweak this. You could say, well, actually, I think senatorial power is a paragraph, but people power, those people outside of the Senate, because remember, we're going from our very wealthy patricians, even in equestrians, who are not technically senatorial, all the way down to the scruffiest Roman living on the street. And then, of course, our conclusion. So you could split it up in that kind of way. Could you do 4 paragraphs, formal, informal, formal, informal? Yeah, but you're probably stretching. You might be stretching yourself a little bit thin for a 20 marker, but again, it's how much you can write. Okay, so there's a third structure which is worth bearing in mind, and there are many structures. Maybe none of these structures work for you, but these are the kind of things that we're thinking about in structuring this kind of essay. So this one, you could have, and this is a better structure because you're constantly having the argument. So paragraph 1 is the power of the people versus the power of the Senate, answering the questions, looking at tribunes, but also assemblies and political bodies and that kind of thing. Paragraph 2 would be the people versus the Senate, and we're looking at mobs, we're looking at patron clients, we're looking at ex-soldiers, we're looking at all that kind of thing in that paragraph. We're having the debate once more there. Paragraph 3, again, people versus the Senate, and we're looking at other things like amicitiae, powerful figures, generals who, fundamentally, the importance of generals to the destruction of the Republic is well, it's one of the sort of leading theories, if you like, following the Marian reforms, etc., etc. So you could, if you decide they're part of the Senate or not part of the Senate, still worth the debate. The idea of money, corruption, bribery, provinces, provincial government, triumphs, all that kind of thing, triumph as an exercise of political power. So you could have 3 areas of focus, and you've got this idea of debating the people versus the Senate in each one. So hopefully you've had a thought or several thoughts about how you might structure your essay. So let's think about our first paragraph. How might it start? Well, it would be something like this, perhaps, and you don't have to do this at all. But we're just reminding ourselves of the beauty of a topic sentence, that introductory sentence to your paragraph that gets everything rolling. So my first paragraph might start something like this. It could be argued that within the formal political system of assemblies, the people of Rome had little power, though, due to the tribunate, they could not be described as powerless. Then we would talk about assemblies, what they do, the potentially limited power of the people due to the structure, the power of the Senate in proposing, the power of the Senate in corruption and bribery and patron-client and blah, blah, blah. But all this is focused on assemblies. And then we would counter-argue it with the powers of the tribune, the idea of veto, proposal of laws and legislation and positions beyond the Senate, but then we'd wind it back in with, well, who do the tribunes really work for? So there we go. That's a kind of rapid run through of the ways you might want to think about this essay, which I have no doubt you will enjoy immensely. Just a quick tip from students in the past who've done it. There are 2 ways of thinking about this in a sense. Well, there's multiple ways of thinking about it, but you can look at the sort of technical, or you should look at the kind of technical, formal way that things work. So the kind of theoretical powers of the Senate, of the tribunes, and so on and so forth. But you can also look at the reality, some of the figures that you will have looked at, and whether those figures, the kind of the real history of real people, actually kind of corresponds to the theoretical powers of the Senate. Now, if you're discussing or debating the theoretical powers of the Senate, the tribunate, whatever, and you can't connect it to a real person, at this stage, don't worry, it's not an issue. If you can connect a theoretical power of the Senate, of the tribunes, to someone that we've studied, then great. Bring it in to show that your idea is valid. Anyway, that's enough of me, and that's enough of the cat, who was listening throughout the whole thing. And I will let you get on with your essay. 30 minutes. Go.